Welcome, my dear brothers and sisters, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 48 today. I'm going to be talking about Protestantism in Europe after World War II. So we begin by looking at what happened in Eastern and Western Europe, and we'll break those two apart immediately following the war. One result of the war was that vast areas of Eastern and Central Europe fell under Soviet rule. While these lands were predominantly Catholic, they also contained significant Protestant minorities. The portion of Germany that fell under Soviet control was the cradle of Protestantism. This led to difficulties between Protestant and communist regimes and to an increased dialogue between Marxists and Protestants. So the area in Eastern Germany that became part or controlled by the Soviet Union was the area that basically the Protestant Reformation was born. So the vast majority of the people there were Protestants, and now they're under a communist regime, which is going to be very restrictive when it comes to their ability to practice their faith. Orthodox Marxist doctrine saw Christianity as an enemy, but some communist leaders followed a policy of open opposition to the church, while others opted for benign neglect based on the conviction that religion was a matter of the past and would simply disappear. And that's what we see in Eastern Germany is the very open opposition to the church, but then other places we're going to see that that wasn't necessarily the case. And it wasn't that the state condoned the church or that it supported it, but it basically just carried on with the opinion that eventually people would tire of the church and tire of religion and they'd move on from it, and so they wouldn't have to have open hostility. And so those were two extremes that were taken in dealing with the church by the communist leadership. In Czechoslovakia and Hungary, the state continued its policy of supporting the churches with public funds. But in East Germany, Christians were subject to serious civil restrictions that prevented them from pursuing an education or holding positions of significant responsibility. So you see the two different attitudes, very different attitudes there in those different places, but all of them are under communist regimes. In Czechoslovakia, the attitude of Protestants had to do with the feeling that they had been oppressed by Catholics since the 30 Years' War. Therefore, when the communist regime declared that all churches would have equal standing before the government, Czech Protestants saw this as an act of liberation. So this is an interesting phenomenon that happened in Czechoslovakia. They actually looked at the communists as coming in and giving them some measure of liberation or of freedom in practicing their religion, because they had always felt like they had been oppressed by Catholicism. And so their opinion was, even if the government is more restrictive, if we're at least on equal footing, then that's actually better than the way it had been. So they became, or at least a significant portion of the Protestants there became actually supportive of the communist regime. The Vatican's opposition to the new regime was seen as an attempt to regain privileges that Catholics had lost, and therefore as a move to oppress them again. So they didn't want to take the side of the Catholics. They didn't like them anyway. They felt like they had been oppressed by them. And when the Catholics objected to the communists coming in, because they, on the other hand, did have a lot of power and control of the country that was being stripped from them, well, the Protestants just kind of carried on as if, well, that's pretty typical of them. They don't like it because they're losing out on what they had, so they're not going to support that, and they didn't. Also, from the time of the Hussite struggles against foreign invaders, Czechs had been convinced that Christian faith must not be something private, but must also have an impact on society, leading it to greater justice. So they saw in Marxism, in communism, the socialist things they thought would be good, in the sense that they wanted to help people in society, and they thought that in some ways socialism was better at that than capitalism or other systems of democracy that were out there. And so they embraced it for that reason. They felt that, we can, not that the communists are ever going to totally support the church, and not that we're ever going to totally support them, but we can use what they want to do to accomplish what we see that we want to do, and in trying to help people. So they took a very favorable stance to communism in those countries. For these reasons, many Czech Protestants responded positively to the Marxist regime, while not abandoning their faith, because they didn't feel like they had to. They thought they could still stay strong as Christians, but also go along with what's happening in their country with this new government. Now let's look at what's going to be happening with Protestantism and Marxism in a little bit more general way in Eastern Europe. Elsewhere in Europe, a lively dialogue was taking place between Christians and Marxists. Often the Marxist participants in this dialogue were not orthodox Marxist-Leninists, but rather revisionists who, while agreeing with the fundamental elements in Marxist analysis of history and society, wished to pursue those insights their own way, and in doing so, they were able to approach religion in a little bit different way, specifically Christianity. A leader in this movement was Ernst Bloch, a Marxist philosopher who agreed with Marx that religion, especially Christianity, has been used as an instrument of oppression. So here's a guy who he's going to be interested in Christianity, but he's also going to be able to keep Marx in play with him, because he's willing to say, the way Christianity is today, the way it's developed in Western culture, really has been an instrument of oppression. But he's going to look back to earlier Christianity and come up with some different conclusions about it. But Bloch saw in early Christianity a movement of protest against oppression, and then went on to reinterpret Christian doctrines and biblical stories through that lens. For him, the principle of hope was early Christianity's most significant contribution to human history. So for Bloch, he goes back and looks at early Christianity before he decides it's been in some way tainted. And in his mind, he sees that it's very much in line with his Marxist ideas, that it was a protest against oppression. And so in that sense, he was able to say, I agree with Marx in the fact that the religion as it is now, especially Christianity, is an instrument of oppression, but it didn't always used to be that way. When you go back to see early Christianity, you look at it and see that it was actually trying to do some of the same things we're trying to do. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that he's right about it. I don't think that you can really look at early Christianity as being primarily a protest movement against oppression. Now, maybe some of the results of being a Christian would lead you to want to fight against oppression, and maybe even to have a protest. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but to say that Christianity is primarily a movement of protest against oppression is incorrect. But regardless of that, that's the way Bloch saw it. And so he was able to maintain his Marxist ideas, but also be able to bring in Christianity in an earlier form that he thought was very much in line with what he believed as a socialist, a communist, and a Marxist. Such views, as well as those of other Marxist revisionists, paved the way for a dialogue that continued into the last decades of the 20th century. This dialogue, along with Bloch's work, contributed to one of the main characteristics of Protestant theology in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, namely an emphasis on hope and on eschatology as a basic theme for Christian theology. So this is a movement to meld together Marxist ideas with Christianity. A leader in this movement was Jürgen Moltmann, whose books have been held as initiating a new era in European theology. Moltmann argues that hope is the central tenet of biblical faith. God is not yet finished with the world. God meets us and calls us from the future. Hope for the last things ought not to be the last chapter, but the first of Christian theology. And what we see with the movement that's going on here, and we've seen it probably throughout this whole study, is that people interpret the scriptures and Christianity in general through the lens of the times in which they live. And that can take place in cultural ideas. That can take place in political ideas and social movements. And so we see here that those who are heavily influenced by Marxist thinking and communist thinking have found a way to, even though those ideas are that religion is bad and needs to be gotten rid of, they found a way to be able to include Christianity in it. And they've taken their political views and melded them with some form of Christianity that they could make work with them. And that's a huge issue. We look at this and we see the problem, but we have to realize that we all do that to a certain extent. When we go into Scripture, we read it not in the purest sense. We don't read it without having already had preconceived notions. We have things we've already been taught. We have theological systems in mind. We have things that we just believe to be true. And we bring that baggage with us. Some of it can have to do with our culture. Some of it can have to do with our politics, the families we were brought up in, the particular denomination that's influenced us the most. You can go on, but to really go into the scripture with no baggage is pretty much impossible. And you have to be careful about that. On the other hand, it can also be helpful. You can have some baggage that can be good. So having strong understanding of Orthodox theology can keep you from reading scripture and going into error. That we can, throughout this study, we've seen that there have been many Christians who were very well-meaning and very well studied, but yet they fell into heretical thinking because they left the bounds of orthodoxy. And once they got outside of those guideposts, they started to see things in Scripture that led them to believe things that are actually heresy. And so it's good to have those guideposts. It's good to be able to say, I know that I'm not going to read anything in Scripture that's going to go against, for instance, that Jesus is God, that he is actually God. You're not going to find anything in Scripture that goes against that, because that's what Scripture teaches. And so if you have that in mind as you read it, you'll never read anything that makes you think, well, wait a minute, maybe Jesus isn't God. But if you go into it with that being in question, I don't know who Jesus is, then you might, or you could fall under the influence of somebody who could persuade you that way. So not saying, again, that all this stuff is bad stuff, but we have to be aware of it, that the things we say others fall into error doing, we can often be guilty of ourselves if we're not very careful about it. This is not a private, individualistic hope, but is the hope for a new order. Therefore, a theology of hope must not lead the faithful to passive waiting for the future, but rather to join those struggles against poverty and oppression that signal God's future. So you see right there that this is very much trying to put Christianity into what's going on with the communist movement at the time. So let's look now towards Western Europe and what happened there. We see Eastern Europe and the Protestants there are going to be very influenced by communist thinking. It's not going to be the case in Western Europe, so what are they going to get there? Meanwhile, in those areas of Western Europe that remained free of Soviet control, the process of secularization accelerated. We talked about this earlier. 20 years after the war, in traditionally Protestant areas such as Scandinavia, West Germany, and Great Britain, church attendance and participation had declined to the point that only a small minority, in some cases fewer than 10%, of the population had any significant contact with any form of organized Christianity. This is shocking. These were the areas that were very heavily Protestant and very much dedicated to Christianity for a number of years. And now, just 20 years after World War II, you see that in some places it's actually less than 10% of the population had any significant contact with any form of organized Christianity. That is shocking. But those numbers are trending, and they definitely did trend in Europe at the time. Still not, you can look at some areas that have gone up and down on that, but still not trending in a good direction. But it's happening in the United States as well. The generations that are following, each one is getting less and less influenced by Christianity, and more of those young people that were brought up in Christian homes are being influenced by Christianity or walking away from their faith once they go to college. So this is a trend that's continuing in the Western world. It's not an isolated incident. You see the numbers there. You can go back and look at some times when it went back up. But overall, it's continued to trend down. And that's very concerning. It's very concerning. Not because we need to pack out churches for numbers' sake, but because our culture is losing the Christian principles that have helped make it great. Now, that doesn't mean we live in some kind of a theocracy or that anybody would want that. No, that's not it. But it's when people live the way that God has said is the right way to live, things are just going to go better. And we see that since we walked away from those things have not gone better. They've gotten worse in a lot of ways. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but it's just that number is very significant. And we need to be very aware that we are living in a more and more of a society that's walking away from the truths of Christianity. In those areas, the issue that most concerned Christian leaders was the relationship between Christianity and the modern, highly secular view of the world, because that was, again, the baggage they had. That's what they were living with. One of the most influential answers to this question was offered by Rudolf Bultmann. He argues that the message of the New Testament is couched in myth, and that for it to be heard today, it must be demythologized. He argued this is important because without the demythologizing, faith is radically misunderstood. Faith is not an effort of the will to believe the unbelievable. The call of the New Testament to faith is not heard when one confuses it with its myths. Myth is every attempt to express in images that which transcends this world. But in the New Testament, besides the basic myth, there is a mythological worldview, one in which God and other supernatural forces intervene, and one in which the universe is seen as existing on three tiers, with heaven above and hell below. The modern world can no longer accept the notion of a world open to supernatural interventions, nor does it view the earth as hanging between hell and heaven. All this, as well as the basic attempts to speak of God in human terms, must be demythologized. So we get with Bultmann the idea that anything in the supernatural needs to be reinterpreted. He reads in the New Testament things about miracles that Jesus performed, miracles that his followers performed, any supernatural interaction, and basically says the problem with the modern world is they're not going to accept that. So you have to figure out a way to reinterpret it, and his thinking on that was to demythologize it, to take away the idea that stuff factually happened and to find another interpretation for it. So we look at these things and we see, if you've been through the study, it all reminds you of some of the stuff that we read about very early on in the classical Greek world. Some of those early church fathers actually began to interpret Scripture in a very allegorical sense because their society would not accept what the Scriptures taught. Now, their reason for it is the opposite of this one. It wasn't because they were offended by the supernatural. It was because they were offended by the mundane. And so anything that had to do with just everyday life they thought was below them. So they allegorized all of that to make it more of a spiritual type of thing. This is just the same. It's the opposite side, but it's the same coin. So in the modern sense, it's not that. It's the opposite. It's that the mundane, the everyday events are acceptable, but the supernatural is not. But it's still, the idea is the same solution. Let's just make this more of it's a symbolic thing. It's not actual events that happened. So there's nothing new under the sun. The same heresies that have taken place in the past come back. The same interpretation errors that happened in the past come back around, and that's what is happening here. It's no different than what early Christianity dealt with way too much allegory in its interpretation of Scripture, and we're getting it here it's a different reason, but it's really just the flip side of the same reason. So now, having said that, some of it is actually not bad. That last statement that I read, it talked about getting away from the idea that earth is hanging between hell and heaven, and that's actually true. Spatially, the writers of the Bible saw heaven as up and hell as down in a literal sense, that the place of God was literally up in the air above us, and the place of the grave, because you buried people on the ground, it was under the ground. And that idea has seeped into our modern way of looking at Christianity. And maybe you wouldn't put it in these terms, but we do think of heaven being above us and hell being below us. And that's not the case. These are a spiritual realm. It's not in any way that earth hangs between heaven and hell. So in that sense, it's actually right. And also what he had to say about the attempts to speak of God in human terms. They need to be demythologized, or not looked at as being literal. They're actually not literal. The idea that God has a body, that he is a king sitting on a throne, anything you want to throw in there, any attempt to speak of God in human terms is not literal. It's actually a way of trying to help human beings who are finite and cannot understand what a spirit is like, because God is a spirit. It's a way of us understanding things about God. And so this is actually good. So it's not all bad. But to take the supernatural events of the New Testament and totally discount them is bad. So it's more bad than good, but there actually is a little bit of good mixed in there too. Let's look further into these ideas. Budman's method of understanding the New Testament drew its inspiration from existentialist philosopher Martin Heidegger. This aspect of his program, however, was not as accepted as widely as his call for demythologization. That's a hard word to say. Whatever the content of a new understanding of the New Testament may be, it is clear that modern people no longer think in terms of a world open to supernatural intervention, and therefore the stories of the New Testament are an obstacle to faith. Now, that may be true, but you don't throw out truth just because people don't like it. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't just say, well, people don't believe in the supernatural anymore, so we'll just get rid of the supernatural. And it hasn't turned out to be true anyway. In the Western world, people are they just believe just as much in the supernatural as they always have, but it's not necessarily grounded in Christianity. It's grounded in a lot of other maybe fake ideas or false teachings. So it's not that our culture went away from the supernatural. It's just gone away from the actual Christian perspective on it. And some of the reason for it is some of this kind of thinking. By the end of the century, a new dimension had been added to theological discussion, namely the conviction on the part of many that modernity was coming to a close. So they're starting to see kind of the closing of an era. For over 2 centuries, Christian theology had been dominated by the issues of modernity. Modernity had provided the basis for much of the colonial enterprise. Now that colonization seemed to be a matter of the past, the same was beginning to be true of modernity. In Europe and elsewhere, there was a growing conviction that notions such as objectivity and universality and the view of the world as a closed entity guided by mechanistic principles were not as strong as they had once seemed. So kind of getting ready for a postmodern world, and where does Christianity and Christian theology fit into that? Such views were also in the background of the contextual theologies that were developing throughout the world at the same time. So we'll look at those further as we continue to go through the study, but just something to remind you of. We're moving now into the postmodern world, and Christianity is going to have to find a place in that world as well. So let's wrap up with just some ideas of what's going on at the turn of the century in the Christian world, especially in the Protestant world. The last decade of the 20th century saw momentous changes in the political configuration of Europe. The decade began with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dismemberment of its empire in Eastern Europe. Then, in November of 1993, the European Union was born, which came to comprise most of Western Europe. These two events brought radical changes to European Protestantism. In Eastern Europe, the fall of communism brought significant changes among Protestants. So those two events, the most influential one was the fall of the Soviet Union and what happened to those nations, those countries who had been controlled by them. The formation of the European Union is certainly going to have an effect in Western Europe, but it's not going to be as significant as that fall of the Soviet Union. In Germany, the churches had been reduced to a defensive posture in the eastern part of Germany. But this changed entirely with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany. In East Germany, much of the conspiracy to overthrow the regime and reunite the nation was led by Reformed and Lutheran pastors and lay leaders, several of whom came to occupy important positions in the effort to rebuild the nation. So they're going to have a big voice in what's going to happen going forward in Germany. Similar events occurred in other lands. In Hungary, Poland, and Romania, Reformed pastors and other leaders made important contributions in the framing of new constitutions. In all this process, the churches came to be seen as more relevant to the life of the people than they had been in decades. So some of the church started to come back in the Eastern world as being more relevant because its leadership had a lot to do with the fact that the nation had gotten out from under communism, and then they became leaders in the new nations, and so it gave them a bigger voice than they had had in a long time. But in Czechoslovakia, a synod of the Lutheran Church deposed its bishop for having collaborated with the regime that had now fallen. So it's not a surprise. We read or talked about earlier that in Czechoslovakia, a lot of the Protestants kind of went with the communist regime. When Yugoslavia broke into pieces, so did the Reformed Christian Church in that nation. So not everything worked out for people in the East for the better, but for a lot of it, it did. In Western Europe, the process of secularization continued unabated and even accelerated, and yet the churches had not lost all vitality. Western European Protestants, whose numbers had been drastically reduced, continued being active in their society and took a place of leadership in the movement to stop the arms race, in issues of international justice, and in service to those disenfranchised or uprooted by industrial development and its consequences. So the church had some relevancy in social issues at the time. In France, the Reformed Church of France was born in 1936 out of a union of two Reformed bodies with Methodists and Congregationalists. So that's a new big Protestant movement in France. In West Germany, Protestant churches employed a staff of 130,000 devoted to social assistance and relief in both Germany itself and abroad. When conditions changed and Germany was reunited after almost half a century, almost two-thirds of the population continued professing Christianity. So over almost half a century, Eastern Germany had been oppressed by communism, and the Protestant church had been, but they came out of it with two-thirds of the population continuing to be professing Christians. Again, we see it time and time again. These other nations, what did we read earlier? Some of them were down to less than 10%. In Eastern Germany, two-thirds. Why? Because they were under persecution. Anytime the church is persecuted, it thrives. It's just the way it is. I can't explain why that is. I don't know if it's that way for other religious movements. I have no idea. But in Christianity, we've seen it time and time and time again, is without fail. When the church is put to the test, it thrives. And again, we see that in Eastern Germany. Thus, while shaken by the momentous events of the 20th century, European Protestantism had not lost its vitality. European churches continued serving the needy, calling for social justice and supporting other churches in poorer countries. But they were no longer the dominant partners in such enterprises, for there were growing numbers who felt that secular agencies could respond to human needs at least as well as the churches. So a move still further into secularization, even in areas that had predominantly been handled by the church in the past. At the same time, large numbers of immigrants from former European colonies in Africa and Asia resulted in an unprecedented rate of growth of religions such as Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. So these people were immigrating into Europe and bringing with them their religion, and they were doing it in such great numbers that they were making a significant difference in the actual religions that were being practiced actively in those countries. Thus, by the second decade of the 21st century, there was no doubt that Europe was moving beyond Christendom and becoming part of a much more complex world. So we're going to stop there for today. Next week, I hope you can join me again. We're going to look at what we looked at over the last 2 weeks, the kind of the movement of religion, Protestantism in Europe. We're going to do that in the United States over the next 2 weeks. So we'll have to break that one up into two parts. We're actually down to just 2 chapters left in the book that I'm using as the main source for this study. But both of the chapters are big. So I think both of them will have to be broken down into 2. So we're looking at probably being done with this in 4 weeks. So we're probably only going to have 4 more of these. That will finish us out and get us into modern times. We will have gone, if you've done this whole thing, we will have gone to the starting at the end of the writing of the New Testament. So the first and second generation of believers, all the way to our own day and time. That's a lot. And it's amazing to me if any of you have actually listened to this whole thing. If you have, then God bless you. But it's going to be finished out soon. And 2 chapters left with probably about 4 episodes left. So hope that you can join me again next week. We'll look at things in the United States you'll probably be very familiar with. And hopefully that'll be interesting to you as well. Again, thank you for joining me today. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and God bless.